Hello, my name is Dr. Ellen Isaacs, and I am a retired internist in New York City. The written version of the articles on which this talk is based can be found by searching FDA and CDC at multiracialunity.org, where you will find multiple references listed also. It is not possible to serve two masters with opposing goals. Contrary to the illusions that many of us have, neither the FDA or the CDC are independent agencies free from corporate or political pressures. Instead, they are openly complicit in the capitalist dictate to prioritize the health of the economy over that of workers. In the case of the FDA, we were shocked by the approval of a new Alzheimer's drug, aducanumab or Aduhelm, that has little, if any, clinical benefit and has substantial risk. In the case of COVID, the CDC has now declared that its job is to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed instead of keeping people healthy. Let's go into some history of the FDA. The FDA came into existence in 1906 under President Theodore Roosevelt in order to protect the public from dangerous medications and foods. But only in the 1950s were its powers expanded to require pre-market review and ban false claims, require prescriptions for some drugs, and recall ineffective or dangerous medications. The evidence newly required for FDA approval had three stages: a small trial among the healthy to determine a safe dose, phase 1, a second among patients to look for efficacy and side effects, phase 2, and two large phase 3 trials to monitor benefits and safety. Then the data would be reviewed by FDA and sometimes outside experts. These processes slowed down the road for drug approvals and threatened pharmaceutical profits. So drug companies began to bypass testing by using rules like that said they could do so if their product was essentially equivalent to an existing one, and that they could submit data summaries and real-world evidence in lieu of formal clinical studies. A trend of major importance has been for pharmaceutical companies to pay more and more of the FDA's costs, increasing from 27% in 1993 to 75% by 2017. Many of the witnesses, as well as expert advisors who come before the FDA, also have their expenses paid by drug companies. Reviewers who oppose a medication or device are often removed from the assessment team. In the late 1980s, AIDS activists were instrumental in demanding that FDA make available life-saving drugs more quickly to the benefit of many. But over the past 30 years, so many new routes to faster approvals have been introduced that the FDA process is now the fastest in the world, and lobbyists for the pharmaceutical manufacturers continue to push for even more speed. As of today, there are accelerated approval, priority review, and breakthrough therapy paths to fast approval, for which 68% of new drugs qualified from 2014 to 16. Once there has been an expedited approval, the manufacturer has over 10 years to complete marketing studies. The new drug Aduhelm was desired by patients since there are no effective drugs for Alzheimer's, which affects 6 million people in the US. It attacks amyloid, long thought to cause the dementia, but now a theory increasingly in doubt. 2 of 3 phase 3 trials were stopped because no benefit was noted, and it also has dangerous side effects in some patients. However, the drug manufacturer Biogen had been meeting with FDA officials looking for a path to approval under the secret project named Project Onyx. Biogen managed to show that a small group with very early disease on the highest dose had some benefit, a result which did not sway any of the 11 expert reviewers, but FDA approved it anyway. It was priced at $56,000 a year, and Biogen's share price rose 40%. While drug companies make trillions in profits with an extra boon from COVID, Americans spend more on prescription drugs annually, $1,200, than anyone else in the world, even though COVID meds and vaccines are temporarily free. Otherwise, the 30% of residents who are uninsured are out of luck entirely and unable to afford many medicines, and the rest pay an average of 14% of their drug costs. 20% of people overall have said they do not fill or finish prescriptions because of the cost, although Medicare clients may soon get some relief. Now, a few words about the CDC. In 1942, the CDC's predecessor, the Office of Malarial Control in War Areas, was created as mosquito-borne malaria and yellow fever continued to emerge from the southeast of the US and infect nearby military bases. As in the motivation for most public health initiatives, the need was to keep workers, or soldiers in this case, in good working condition. Such had been the reasoning behind the attack on hookworm in 1910 and many other public health initiatives. The permanent CDC was established in 1947 to surveil disease in US and the world. A profound change occurred in 1983 when the agency was authorized to accept gifts from industry and other private parties. This practice was expanded in 1992 when Congress created the nonprofit CDC Foundation, CDCF, and the large inflow of funds led to conflicts of interest and corruption. Since 1995, the CDCF has received $161 million from corporations, and according to a report by the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services in 2007, the CDC failed to identify conflicts of interest among its advisory committee members over half of the time. From 2014 to 18 alone, CDC received $80 million from Pfizer, Biogen, and Merck. Roche, the maker of Tamiflu, donated $193,000 to fund a CDC flu prevention campaign. The CDC's record on lead abatement, in which HUD, EPA, the White House, and Congress also played large roles, is another story of compromise. In 1987, CDC called for complete abatement of the lead hazard, which was affecting mainly poor and Black children. But in 1991 stated, quote, "In general, the most thorough abatements are believed to be the most effective in reducing blood lead levels and residual lead in the environment. But given the limited resources for abatement, a balance must be struck between doing the best possible abatements in fewer units and using reasonably good, less expensive methods in more units," unquote. In 2002, the Bush administration replaced lead experts on the CDC advisory panel with 5 individuals friendly to the paint industry. Lead poisoning remains a major problem today. In 2016, a group of over a dozen senior scientists, calling themselves CDC Scientists Preserving Integrity, Diligence, and Ethics in Research, filed an ethics complaint stating that the agency was being influenced by corporate and political interests. The CDC responded by claiming that, quote, "its public-private partnerships are synergistic and beneficial," unquote. The CDC's policy on so-called prohibited donors actually states that, quote, "the fact that a potential donor is a prohibited source does not necessarily mean that a proposed gift may not be accepted, only that it must be carefully evaluated for possible conflicts of interest," unquote. Some examples cited by the scientist petitioners were inflation of the successes of the Wise Woman program for women's health and the ties to Coca-Cola of top officials who blamed lack of exercise as opposed to sugar intake for obesity. In 2018, Director Brenda Fitzgerald resigned when her investments in drug insurance and tobacco companies were disclosed. Now, COVID. Long before Trump, the pandemic, and the appointment of Robert Redfield as director, the CDC had been suffering from budget and staff cuts. In the last decade, public health lost nearly 80,000 workers in local, state, and national agencies, and there is a great need to improve data collection systems. But the weaknesses and lack of independence of the CDC were brought into sharp focus with the onset of the COVID pandemic. It is true that much of the blame for the disastrous early response to COVID can be laid at the door of Trump. But what is clear is that the CDC and its leaders were complicit, from failing to warn about transmission from Europe or give any public warning about the depth of the threat, to failing to use available tests from the World Health Organization, to capitulating to losing its mandate to track data, to recognizing that the virus was airborne and push for good masks, to isolating cruise passengers or banning choirs, to approving the removal of asylum seekers, the CDC gave in over and over again to political interests. In August 2020, the CDC announced that close contacts of a COVID patient did not have to test if they were asymptomatic, advice reversed a month later. Even if not sufficiently stringent, when the CDC did issue workplace guidelines, as in May 2020, OSHA almost never enforced them. A full 10 months into the pandemic, CDC advised, quote, to preserve the supply of N95 respirators for healthcare workers and other first responders, CDC recommends non-valve multi-layer cloth masks or non-medical disposable masks for community use, unquote. Many CDC scientists quit in disgust over that year. However, the coming of a Democratic administration did not mean that COVID policy was freed from political and economic intrusion. Although Biden promised to put science in charge, in fact, the interests of the economy have come first. Although 2,500 people are still dying every week, and 79% of the population still lives in substantial or high transmission areas, and new variants are increasing, Biden has declared that the pandemic is over and CDC guidance goes along. At the behest of the airlines, all masking requirements were lifted for passengers and staff, then for local transit passengers and health facilities. Schools have reopened without masking or adequate ventilation or testing. The main administration strategy to control COVID has been vaccinations. However, only 68% of the population has received the initial 2-dose vaccine, and only 32% of children between 5 and 11. Only 33% has received any booster, and only about 4% have received all 3 booster shots. Although vaccination are the only containment steps now being advocated beyond suggestions to be crowded in indoor situation, this reflects a lack of any public relations or easy access campaigns. The CDC made it clear that its guidelines or suggestions do not supersede state or local ones. Mask mandates, even in healthcare facilities, quarantine of infected individuals, surveillance, and improved ventilation requirements have been shelved. Free masks, tests, and vaccines are less available. There has been no campaign to increase international vaccination, which is essential to decrease the rate of virus mutations. In perhaps its most heinous policy, the CDC has continued to support a restrictive immigration policy, Title 42, barring the entry of asylum seekers except unaccompanied minors who are neither tested nor treated on public health grounds, while allowing tourists to enter the country if tested. Some critics of the CDC and FDA believe the solution is to make them independent agencies, free from DHHS oversight and with a director and funding not subject to congressional authorization. This might solve some problems, but not the major conflict. These agencies exist in a society in which the measure of success is profits made, and working people, be they blue or white collar, are valued only as a means to create those profits. As such, the public's health is necessary only to provide enough workers in good working condition and to control contagion so as to protect the corporate class. To guarantee the well-being, happiness, and health of the working population as a goal in itself would be of no merit and much too expensive. How is it that so many of us accept this trade-off? It has much to do with the illusion of individual responsibility that we are taught, that each of us is responsible for our own status in life, including our health. It's a matter of our habits, our nutrition, whether we exercise, while factors of stress, poverty, environmental hazards, and health care are downplayed. Racism also plays a huge part, since non-white workers suffer a hugely disproportionate share of poor health and health care, dangerous and underpaid work, low-grade housing, and a contaminated environment. As long as too many white workers believe that they are at least relatively shielded from such condition, and that Black, Latin, Native, and immigrant workers deserve their lot, the ability to wage struggles for better conditions for all is deeply compromised. It is true that the capitalist government and its agents, such as the CDC or FDA, do not have our best interest in mind as such, but they do need for enough of us to be healthy to produce and not endanger their own health. Public health guidance is thus often in line with what is actually good for our health. We must carefully analyze all government guidelines as to the true motives behind them, which may be as glaringly racist and abusive as the Tuskegee experiments, or simply expedient like delayed mask messaging. Other messages, like that for nearly everyone to get vaccinated, are clearly correct. However, the refusal to do more to enable international vaccination clearly puts us all at risk from evolving variants, but not enough to override the pharmaceutical industry's greed for profits. Many groups who have long been abused by the US medical system, such as Black and Native Americans, hesitate to accept any government-given advice. Many right-wingers who live with the illusion that freedom is the absence of any social constraints or interdependence refuse to comply with any government advice. Instead, we must analyze the advice and demands from the institutions of our society and adopt those which are to our benefit. At the same time, we must fight to change our society from one based on the inherent conflict between workers and capitalists, between public health and private greed, to one run by and for working people, in which agencies will be guided only by our best interests. That will require revolutionary change, which is why I joined the Progressive Labor Party many years ago. For now, we must keep our wits about us and organize to stay well and strong while we fight for our immediate needs and build for a longer-term struggle.